the International Day of Persons with Disabilities and the state of persons with disabilities in Nigeria. The Senate notes that the UN General Assembly, by Resolution 47-3 of 1992, proclaimed and designated December 3rd of every year as the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. Further notes that the observance of the day is intended to promote global awareness and understanding of disability issues and mobilize support for the dignity, rights, and well-being of persons with disabilities. Aware that the observance of the day seeks to increase awareness of gains to be derived from the integration and mainstreaming of disabilities in every aspect of human endeavor, including political, social, economic, and cultural lives of nations. Further aware that the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which took effect from 3rd May 2008, affirms that all persons with all types of disabilities must enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms, thereby protecting the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities. Observes that many nations have, through legislation, domesticated the intent of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. An example of a few include Australia, which came up with Disabilities Discrimination Act of 1992, in which it sought to eliminate discrimination against persons with disabilities, access to premises, work, accommodation, social services, and the rest. Canada came up with a national building code in 2010 to provide standards that must be complied with in the provision of infrastructure and buildings, embedding codes and practices that are user-friendly to persons with disabilities. Lebanon came up with a barrier-free environment legislation in 1998 that is favorable to persons with disabilities. The USA has its legislation tagged Americans with Disabilities Act 1990, a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. Kenya's Persons with Disabilities Act of 2003 provides for the rights and rehabilitation of persons with disabilities and promotion of disability rights education. And notes that while Nigeria ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2007 and its optional protocol in 2010, it was only in January 2019 that President Muhammadu Buhari signed into law the Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities Prohibition Act 2018. Of course, this followed 9 years of relentless advocacy by disability rights groups and activists. Aware, distinguished colleagues, that the law prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability and imposes sanctions, including fines and prison sentences on those who contravene it. Equally aware that the law stipulates a 5-year transitional period for modifying public buildings, structures, and automobiles to make them accessible and user-friendly for persons with disabilities. Further aware, distinguished colleagues, that the law provides for the establishment of a national commission for persons with disabilities that will be responsible for ensuring that people with disabilities have access to housing, education, and health care. The commission will be empowered to receive complaints and rights violations and support victims to seek legal redress, among other duties. Concerned that according to the World Health 2011 World Disability Report, about 15% of Nigeria's population, or at least 25 million people, have disability. Many of them face a number of human rights abuses, including stigma, discrimination, violence, and lack of access to healthcare, housing, and education. Equally concerned that persons with disabilities are still challenged by accessibility and participation in Nigeria, an indication that disabilities issues are far from being mainstreamed under our jurisdiction. Perturbed that persons with disabilities still face discrimination in the areas of equal access and full participation in the political, social, economic, and cultural aspect of our national life, and as well as in employment and decent work. Notes that the International Day of Persons with Disabilities is an opportunity for the nation to celebrate and applaud the role and contribution of persons with disabilities in nation building in all sectors, especially the Paralympic sportsmen and women who have always done Nigeria proud. I therefore urge the Senate to resolve: 1, to urge the federal government to fully implement the provisions of the Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities Prohibition Act 2018, especially the composition and establishment of the National Commission for Persons with Disabilities. 2, urge Ministry of Works and Housing and other MDAs involved in infrastructure and public buildings to adopt codes and standards that are user-friendly to persons with disabilities. 3, urge Ministry of Land Transportation and Transport operators to be aware of their obligations to persons with disabilities. And finally, 4, urge Ministry of Information and National Orientation Agency to undertake aggressive awareness campaign against all forms of discrimination against persons with disabilities. Distinguished colleagues and President of the Senate, I so move.
Well, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I'm Michael Okwemi Bamidele. I represent Ekiti Central Senatorial District. Mr. President, I rise to second the motion very ably moved by our distinguished colleague, Senator Giang. And in seconding this motion, Mr. President, I want to say that the intention of the United Nations in designating the 3rd of December of every year to commemorate the plight and, of course, in a very special way, identify with the physically challenged in our midst, was to ensure that every government, the essence, Mr. President, was for the United Nations to ensure that every government and people around the world would do everything possible to make lives easier and more meaningful for the physically challenged. And I want to thank our distinguished colleague for bringing this, because it's also to ensure advocacy, which is part of the intention of designating the 3rd of December as International Day of the Physically Challenged. I listened to the prayers, Mr. President, and how I wish that the prayer had recognized again the fact that philosophers have interpreted the world and what is left is to change it. And in so doing, I wish one of the prayers had been, for instance, that every senator will contribute a sum of 100,000 naira, for instance, towards ensuring that life is made more meaningful to the physically challenged. For 109 people, Mr. President, this will amount to 10.9 million naira. This will be a way of identifying, and I am happy there is a provision in our procedure for additional prayer. And I know from what Comrade Abamoro has whispered to me, I'm sure he will have some additional prayer in that regard, but when we come to that. But Mr. President, I'm happy to second this motion. I so second.
Senator Barrow. I am Senator Barrow Jibrin, Northern Kano North. Mr. President, let me first of all commend my friend for bringing up this motion, as well as commend the United Nations for setting or for declaring every December the 3rd to be the International Day for the people with a disability. Mr. President, this is good because it will allow emphasis to be placed on the plight of people with disabilities all over the world. Yes, in this country we have just passed a bill, a law has been made to take care of them, but I think that's not the end of it. We must make sure that the law is well implemented. It's one thing to have the law, but it's another thing to make sure that the law is well implemented in order to take care of these people who form a very, very important part of our society. We are seeing, we've been seeing, or we always see what is done to assist and to integrate people with disabilities in other climes. We don't see that here. You see how car parks are configured in a way that will allow certain space or certain spaces to be given to those with disabilities. Even toilet facilities are also created to give succor to those who have disabilities. But we don't have that here. And apart from that, you could even see, we always see in schools overseas, other climes, where sign writers, those who communicate to those who are deaf, on how to listen to their lecturers, to their teachers in the classrooms, so that they can really integrate in the formal educational system of such countries, in a way that those that cannot hear are not put in a disadvantaged position. But we don't have that here. So there's a need our government, both all types of government, local government, state government, and the government at the center, to have a system where we can provide all these facilities and personnel to take care of those who have disabilities in different forms. It's a wake-up call, and we need to really key into the intentment of this motion, so that we can make the lives of those with disabilities, better in this country. We are still far from there. We need to learn from what is happening elsewhere or in other climes, so that we can really be taken seriously on our zeal to make sure that we help those who are physically challenged. Mr. President, I so submit. We go to the President to fully implement the provisions of the Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities Prohibition Act 2018, especially the composition of the National Commission for Persons with Disabilities. Those in favor of prayer 1 say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Prayer 2, urge the Ministry of Works and Housing and other MDAs involved in infrastructure and public buildings to adopt codes and standards that are user-friendly to people with disabilities. Those in favor of prayer 2 say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Prayer 3, urge the Ministry of Land Transportation and transport operators to be aware of their obligations to people with disabilities. Those in favor of this prayer say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. And prayer 4, urge Ministry of Information and the National Orientation Agency to undertake aggressive awareness campaign against all forms of discrimination against people with disabilities. Those in favor of this prayer say aye. Those against say nay. Those in favor of the additional prayer say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Distinguished colleagues,
This is a very important reminder to all of us as parliamentarians representing Nigerians. This is a legislature that should continuously provide legislative interventions on how to make life better for citizens. Those Nigerians who suffer from disabilities need our attention even much more. And if you want to see how a society is progressing, judge it by how it is treating the vulnerable and particularly those that have disabilities. So I want to congratulate our brother, our friend, the prayer warrior of the Senate, Senator I.D. Gyang, for bringing up this motion. Thank you. Leader of the Senate.